It's a bird. It's a plane. It's a bust. Well, sort of. It's complicated. Hi, I'm David DiCerto, and join me as I take a look at director James Gunn's new Superman through a Catholic lens. J.J. Abrams' 2015 The Force Awakens opens with the line, "This will begin to make things right." A sly, reassuring wink from Abrams to Star Wars fans that his film would course-correct a beloved franchise that had gone off the rails. Unfortunately, the Force was not with Abrams, and that promise went unfulfilled. I sensed a similar signaling in posters for James Gunn's Superman, emblazoned with the elevating tagline, "Look up," an encouraging and confident clue that this would be a much different film than Zack Snyder's grim and gritty Man of Steel from 2013, starring Henry Cavill. Man of Steel and Snyder's subsequent attempts to build a cinematic universe around Superman and other DC Comics characters, along the lines of what competitor Marvel Comics did to massive success, were, by comparison, box office kryptonite. So much so that Warner Brothers, DC's parent company, pulled the plug on the so-called Snyderverse and hired James Gunn, along with Peter Safran, to chart a bold course for a complete reboot of DC properties, kicking things off with the most iconic hero of them all. And in one sense, Gunn makes good on his promise, delivering a film that in tone and tenor is worlds apart from Snyder's darker vision, right down to the lighter colors of Superman's costume. He even got his bright red trunks back. Strongly influenced by the optimism and visual idealism of Grant Morrison's and Frank Quitely's all-star Superman comic series, which the production designer called this film's guiding light, Gunn restores much-needed uplift under Superman's cape, reviving the character's buoyancy. That being said, on a deeper level, I'm starting to feel that any attempt for modern-day Hollywood to actually make a good Superman movie, or rather to truly understand the character, is as doomed as the hero's home planet of Krypton. As a lifelong comic book geek, I have to admit, Superman, together with Batman, have always been my favorite superheroes. Moreover, in America's and possibly the world's collective imagination, the Man of Steel occupies a unique and special place, soaring high above all other costume crime fighters, to the extent that one survey ranks the signature S on his chest as the second most globally recognized symbol after the cross. So it's hard for me to be completely objective, but here goes. And remember, these glasses don't give me super critic's vision. What follows is just this mild-mannered Catholic film reviewer's opinion. Feel free to disagree. But before I unpack some of the spiritual stakes under Superman's cape, first for parents. The film obviously contains lots of comic book-style violence, with the seemingly now requisite, for these types of movies anyway, skyline-leveling urban destruction. There's a few instances of profanity and an execution-style murder shown from a distance, so best for older kids and up. But I leave that to parents' discretion. Those familiar with the character know that Superman is often affectionately referred to as the Big Blue Boy Scout for his unwavering altruism and honesty, for always doing the right thing and always seeing the good in others. In that charitable spirit, I'll lead with what I liked about the film, starting with David Corenswet, who plays Superman/Clark Kent, and who is terrific, even though there is another character actually called Mr. Terrific, who we'll get to in a bit. Some reviewers were turned off by Corenswet's floppy hair and skater dude vibe, but I found him appealing and thought he brought a genuine warmth, playful charm, and empathy to the dual roles. I would love to see his Superman in a better film. Now look, in my book, and I'm sure I'm not alone here, the late Christopher Reeve is and always will be Superman. But those are big red boots to fill, perhaps too big for any actor, including Corenswet, and for that matter, Cavill, who was good in his own right and was somewhat hamstrung by Snyder's bleak take, which many critics panned, though I thought was not completely without merit. But whereas Cavill brought a brooding, conflicted gravitas to the role, a Kryptonian Hamlet of sorts, Corrin Sweat brings a refreshingly disarming sincerity and optimism that harkens back to Reeve. Plus, he really looks the part. In explaining why he agreed to direct the project, Gunn says, quote, "I wanted to tell the story about someone who was truly good in a world that doesn't value goodness, in a world that makes fun of basic kindness and basic human values. The fact that he can fly and lift buildings and shoot laser beams out of his eyes was really secondary to who he was as a person and what he stood for." End quote. Now, I'm with him on that. And Corrin Sweat, by and large, does a good job at conveying all of that. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty to criticize about the film, and I'll try to cover everything, including that what he stands for bit, but I want to give credit where credit is due. And even if, in my opinion, he's not fully successful, Gunn's desire to celebrate goodness is commendable and worth noting, especially in pop culture where cynicism or outright nihilism is often applauded as somehow serious or sophisticated, and where hope, wholesomeness, and heroism are pooh-poohed as old-fashioned, and where kindness and virtue are dismissed as sentimentality. A major problem with Snyder's take on Superman was that in an effort to make him edgy and relevant to modern viewers, he had Superman, the embodiment of hope, say incongruently cynical things like, "No one stays good in this world." Ironic, given Hans Zimmer's main musical theme in Snyder's film is entitled Ideal of Hope. Here, Gunn, at least on the surface, returns to that ideal, though I'll explain why I think the film ultimately falls flat or even undermines the very aspirational goals it sets out to achieve. But again, I should say, any attempt to make goodness and kindness attractive, even if flawed in its execution, is, these days, almost as astonishing as leaping over a tall building in a single bound. Now, just as Superman draws his powers from Earth's yellow sun, so any actor donning the cape can only draw his performance from the screenplay and the director. As for the script, it's a super mess. It's not even worth getting into the overstuffed plot because it's largely nonsensical. No origin story here, and I get it, we've seen it numerous times before, who needs to watch Krypton explode yet again? Here, Gunn opens his tale with Superman already on the global stage for 3 years, and already romantically involved with fellow Daily Planet reporter Lois Lane, played by the always marvelous, but here woefully underutilized Miss Maisel herself, Rachel Brosnahan. The film literally opens right in the middle of the action, with an uncharacteristically bloodied Superman suffering the first defeat of his superhero career at the hands of an armored adversary, the Hammer of Baravia, controlled by Superman's nemesis and evil genius, Lex Luthor, played with sufficient maniacal glee by Nicholas Hoult. Raising the curtain in media res would have been interesting if it actually paid off, but it's a jumping off point to nowhere or to too many places, which is worse, none of which makes sense or makes us truly care about anyone except for Superman's superpowered CGI dog Krypto, who steals the show and saves the day more than Superman. Along the way, there's a battle with a giant monster, angry monkey bots, an escalating international crisis, a pocket universe that ends up creating a rift in reality, don't ask, and lots of toppling skyscrapers. There's also a slew of secondary characters that don't have a heck of a lot to do, including a trio of super friends who one assumes will be part of Gunn's extended franchise plans. Nathan Fillion as Green Lantern Guy Gardner, a cosmic cop with a bad haircut, Isabella Merced as the winged warrior Hawkgirl, and a fabulous Eddie Gathegi as the super smart Mr. Terrific, who not only gets the best toys, but the best action sequence. I could have done without a cameo of another character, beloved in comic circles, reduced here to a drunken interstellar party girl. But as a friend of mine put it, Gunn's gonna be Gunn. Look, I get it. Warner Brothers wanted a mulligan to take the DC cinematic universe in a more fun, feel-good direction after scrapping Snyder's drab and dreary films. So they went out and hired the anti-Snyder in Gunn, who had hit a home run for Marvel with Guardians of the Galaxy. But Gunn's quirky brand of humor, in my opinion, doesn't work with a more storied property like Superman. Sure, I appreciate how he tries to make his movie feel more like a comic book, compared to Snyder's grand opera. And anyone who reads comics regularly knows plots can get pretty wacky. But at times, this film just feels plain silly. Rewatch Richard Donner's 1978 classic, the Christopher Reeve version, and see how entertaining and intelligent aren't mutually exclusive. Brains beats brawn, Lex says in the film. I wish the screenwriters had taken their own advice. And Superman seems to get beat up a lot in this movie. Gunn has commented that in the comics, Superman has become so leveled up power-wise that he's practically invincible. Not great for drama. So Gunn wanted his Superman to be more vulnerable and relatable. Fair enough, but watching the film, seeing Krypto save his butt multiple times, the pendulum seems to have swung in the opposite direction, reminding me of G.K. Chesterton's definition of a heresy as a narrow truth at the expense of other truths, like Arianism, which downplayed Christ's divinity, or its flip side, Docetism, which denied Christ's humanity. Make Superman all-powerful, godlike, and he loses his relatability. Make him too vulnerable, which I feel this film does, and you strip him of some of his super luster. It's a delicate balance. Plus, he gives this whole speech at the end about how his humanity is his greatest strength, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He's adopted, embraced our values and our way of life, but despite his assertion to Lex that I'm as human as anyone, let's face it, that's clearly not the case, which makes his commitment to defending us humans all the more selfless, virtuous, and heroic. He has inhuman power that could kill us all without breaking a sweat, but he doesn't. And speaking of vulnerable, I kind of cringed at Lex Luthor crying at the end. To paraphrase Tom Hanks, there's no crying in supervillainy. Some political conservatives have been in an uproar over what they perceive as the film's promotion of a political agenda, concerns which, in my opinion, are overblown. Sure, you can certainly read into it what you want. Superman is arrested as an alien immigrant and deported to a maximum security prison. But denouncing it as woke propaganda is a stretch, and gives the ludicrous script far more credit than it deserves. Look, Hollywood is, by and large, liberal. That's not a headline for the Daily Planet any more than water is wet. But in terms of problems with this film, political undercurrents rank pretty low. Cavill's Superman was also arrested by the government in Snyder's Man of Steel, and that film was accused, by some, also unfairly, of having right-wing leanings. Over the years, pundits on both sides of the aisle have tried to claim Superman for their own, with liberals arguing how in early Depression-era comics, he battled slumlords and championed the economically downtrodden, a social justice warrior, Tom Joad in a cape, while conservatives are quick to point to patriotic covers during World War II of him fighting Nazis and punching Hitler. The reality is that partisan labels bounce off Superman as easily as bullets. Like we find out in the film, it's hard to contain Superman in a box. And as for the subplot involving the two fictitious nations of Baravia and Jarhanpur, and the heated discussion it sparked about whether or not they're screen surrogates for Russia-Ukraine or Israel-Gaza, who knows? Who cares? I'm still scratching my head as to what purpose the whole invasion serves in the convoluted story. But perhaps no aspect of the film has generated more controversy than its omission of Superman's catchphrase, truth, justice, and the American way. Instead, he now fights for truth, justice, and the human way, whatever that means. Now, this deserves a more nuanced explanation than I can provide here. Yeah, it's really disgraceful that mentioning America has somehow come to be a bad or controversial thing, especially when it comes to such an icon of Americana as Superman. Things have certainly changed since 1980 when, in Superman 2, Christopher Reeve literally flies an American flag back to a repaired White House and tells the president, "I won't let you down again." But as Superman also stands for truth, the truth is the phrase, "and the American way," was a later add-on to his original fight for truth and justice, and was only introduced during a radio serial years after his first appearance on the pages of Action Comics in 1938. But just because it was added later doesn't mean it's wrong or not a genuine reflection of who the character is and always has been, any more than adding "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s was political revisionism. As Catholics, we say the Nicene Creed every Sunday. But just because those words and phrases were formulated 3 centuries after Christ does not mean the theological truths they more clearly and definitively articulate were not authentically part of the deposit of faith up to that point. And no, I'm not trying to equate a superhero's catchphrase and the creed, but merely trying to show how sometimes things expressed explicitly at a later date can help amplify something always implicitly held. I just wish we could go back to the days when, as in the 78 film, Superman could say he fought for truth, justice, and the American way, and Lois Lane, played by the incomparable Margot Kidder, could respond, "Then you'll have to end up fighting every elected official." Look, Superman fights his never-ending battle for truth and justice for people everywhere. But he didn't come from just anywhere. When his co-creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, both Jewish whose families had fled rising anti-Semitism in Europe, had Superman land on Earth as an infant, they had him crash down in a Kansas cornfield, outside a town that would later come to be known, in 1949, as Smallville. Can't get more American than that. Just as Achilles doesn't make sense apart from ancient Greece, or King Arthur from post-Roman Britain, or for that matter, Black Panther apart from Wakanda, so Superman is as American as apple pie. Want proof? Read the brilliant Superman comic called Red Sun, which imagines an alternate history in which his rocket didn't land in Kansas, but behind the Iron Curtain, and he is raised to fight for Soviet ideals. Also, a human way, though not a very desirable one. I've always held that his Kryptonian, biological parents may have made him bulletproof and super strong, but it was his earthly parents, Jonathan and Martha Kent, and the Midwest, small-town, yes, Judeo-Christian values they imparted are what make him Superman. Which brings us to his parents, both sets. And here's my main beef with the film, where, as much as it pains me to say so, it lost me faster than a speeding bullet. For those not familiar with his Moses-like origin, Superman, whose birth name is Kal-El, is the last surviving son of the planet Krypton, sent to Earth by his parents, Jor-El and Lara, as a baby, right before Krypton explodes. Granted, Superman's backstory has evolved and been embroidered over the years, influenced heavily by Donner's 78 classic starring Reeve and Marlon Brando as Jor-El. Still, in my opinion, the gold standard, not just of Superman adaptations, but superhero films in general. And it's true, certain individual comic book writers have explored alternate interpretations over the years. But the generally held mythology is that Superman's parents sent him to Earth not just to survive, but to be a source for good. They can be a great people, Kal-El, Brando tells his son across time and space. They wish to be. They only lack the light to show them the way. For this reason, above all, their capacity for good. I have sent them you, my only son. This messianic language, Superman is often depicted as a Christ figure, is echoed even in Snyder's more somber telling, with Jor-El, in that film played by Russell Crowe, offering similar aspirational encouragement. You will give the people of Earth an ideal to strive towards. What Gunn does, and I won't give away any spoilers, but it basically it trashes those noble sentiments in a way that I felt was totally unnecessary, and in the film turns public opinion against Superman. Maybe I'm making much ado about nothing. There are examples of other comic book writers who have played fast and loose with established lore, and Gunn has always fancied himself an iconoclast. But it is a big deal, as this film will establish the moral tone of an entire proposed cinematic universe. I know some of you might be thinking, it's just popcorn escapism. True, but let me propose this. Together with the cowboy western, Superman is the closest thing America has to a secular national mythology, a symbol of what, at its best, our nation represents, what we aspire to, truth and justice, what stories we tell about ourselves and how we tell them, or more importantly, how we change them, matters. One could argue that by throwing the curveball he does concerning Clark's Kryptonian parents, Gunn actually elevates Ma and Pa Kent and their values in defining Clark/Superman as the man and hero he is. And that's true to a degree, but that argument doesn't really hold water. Here's why. Gunn has a reason for reworking the mythology, which I find equally problematic and which becomes apparent in a later scene between Clark and Jonathan Kent, played by Pruitt Taylor Vince. Now, I gotta admit, I'm a sucker for tender father-son scenes like this. They always pull at my heartstrings. And yes, Pa Kent's line about how our actions, our moral choices make us who we are is consistent with Catholic teaching about free will. But as several religious and conservative critics have also pointed out, there's something subtly subversive in the exchange. Okay, Clark's been rocked by this revelation about his Kryptonian heritage and his parents' motives for sending him to Earth, making him question everything he thought he knew about them and himself. And that dilemma was necessary for Gunn to set up this scene. In this moment of identity crisis, Jonathan, in trying to comfort his son, tells Clark, quote, "Parents aren't here to tell their children who they're supposed to be." Well, of course, parents want their children to grow up to be their own persons, but good parents are essential for shaping the moral compass which will point their kids in the direction of who they should be. So to push back on Pa Kent, part of a parent's responsibility is exactly that, being a moral voice in telling their children who they're supposed to be. It's kind of the job, being the primary model and influence in shaping their child's moral vision. All the more important when the child in question can lift buildings. So a scene which celebrates parenthood and the salt-of-the-earth sincerity of Pa Kent also undermines it by essentially downplaying or minimizing the role parents play in forming their children. A subversive, calculated move worthy of Lex Luthor. When you think about it, the evolution, or should I say devolution, of Superman films has less to do with their respective takes on the title character and more to do with how his parents, particularly the Kents, are portrayed. The '78 film gave us Glenn Ford as Pa Kent and beautifully exalted the yellow fields of Kansas and not our yellow sun as the true source of Clark's superpower. Even Snyder's version, though an order of magnitude down from Donner, retained a certain nostalgia for Clark's roots, which even Kevin Costner's out-of-character suggestion as Pa Kent that his son shouldn't have saved a school bus full of classmates to protect his identity couldn't completely tarnish. Here, the Kents are cliches and come off as yokels who are caricaturized even as they are honored. Even when trying to present a more Rust Belt realism, Pruitt Taylor Vince doesn't have the rugged charisma of a Ford or Costner. modern Hollywood can't help presenting its own vision of Middle America, whose values they just don't get, or in some cases, despise. Hollywood doesn't hate Superman, but it does seem embarrassed by his parents. In past films, they were Clark's pillars. Here they come across at times as flyover-state punchlines. 10 years ago, conservative New York Times commentator Ross Douthat wrote an essay commemorating the 30th anniversary of Back to the Future, another iconic film. In it, he observes that America in 2015 was further removed chronologically and culturally from the year of its original release, 1985, than were the viewers who first saw it in 1985 from 1955, the year its protagonist, Marty McFly, returned to in his time-traveling DeLorean. Likewise, it's hard to believe today's viewers are more removed from the 1978 Christopher Reeve film than viewers in 1978 were from the debut of Superman in 1938, so lovingly evoked in the 78 film's black and white opening. And again, I'm not just talking about the passing of years, but the complete reorientation of what Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls the social imaginary, the mutually shared cultural and moral ideas and values that shape what we call our civilization. The question isn't any longer, why won't Hollywood make a movie that reflects our shared values? But is it still possible to talk about shared values at all? And moreover, how can Superman stand for truth in a world that rejects objective truth in favor of subjective feelings, my truth and your truth? Whose truth does Superman fight for? It's why all the anger over the deletion of the American way misses a deeper, more sobering point. That American way that Superman stood for was not just a set of vague or generic ideas. They were values. They were virtues. Truth, justice, compassion, objective right and wrong, rooted in biblical tradition. In the Donner film at Pa Kent's funeral, there's a white-steepled country church in the distance. Crosses adorn the tombstones, and Ma Kent clutches what appears to be a family Bible. Even Snyder included a scene with a young Clark wandering into church to talk with his pastor, framed by a stained glass window of Jesus in Gethsemane. None of that here. Some may rightfully say Siegel and Schuster, both Jewish men, had none of that in their stories, that it was superimposed later. But back in the 1930s, it would have been assumed by simply having Clark grow up in Middle America. It's why I like the recent Superman and Lois TV series, sadly canceled, which imagined its title couple as parents who decide to move from Metropolis back to Smallville to raise their two teenage sons with those very core small-town values. Though sadly, that series also avoids any overt religion. Ironically, the scientific-minded Mr. Terrific identifies, in the comics at least, as an atheist. An intentional choice by Gunn? Who knows? Maybe it's because he liked his T-spheres and cool leather jacket. What's left in all these more modern retellings is not a goodness grounded in biblical virtue, but niceness. And as C.S. Lewis observed, quote, "A world of nice people, content in their own niceness, looking no further, turned away from God, would be just as desperately in need of salvation as a miserable world, and might even be more difficult to save." End quote. In a world desperate for goodness, niceness won't save us. Of course, as believers, we don't look to Superman for salvation. Our Savior doesn't bear an S on his chest, but the wounds caused by our sins on his hands, feet, and side. Look, I don't want to dump on this film. Like I said, it gets some things right. It has heart. Superman clearly values the sanctity of life. In one scene, when talking about their favorite bands growing up, he was pop, she was punk rock, Clark tells Lois that maybe being kind and seeing goodness and hope in the world is the real punk rock, meaning the real countercultural attitude in a world of cynicism. That's profound in a sweet way. The whole boy and his dog story arc with Krypto is also heartwarming. I like the fact that Gunn paid tribute to John Williams' iconic score from the '78 film. Lois and Superman's mid-air fairy tale kiss at the end is a welcome celebration of good old-fashioned romance, as the final moving montage of Clark's childhood memories is a poignant celebration of a loving, traditional, intact family. Those seemingly little flourishes, love between a man and a woman, a happy, loving family with a mom and a dad, mean something in a world where traditional values are increasingly viewed, much like Superman in this film, as an alien threat. Gunn soars in feel-good spirit, but stumbles in soul, getting the symbols right, but losing the Judeo-Christian virtues that give them meaning. By putting red trunks on a hollowed-out icon and adding some, admittedly cool, electric guitar riffs of Williams' music, we lost something in the exchange. As a result, Gunn's Man of Steel has a tinny ring. This past April, Superman turned 90. He's a comic book character, yes, but he's also a symbol, as much as the S on his chest. And as Catholics, we understand the power of symbols, especially in art. He symbolizes hope and goodness. It's part of his lasting appeal. In our war-torn world, who doesn't wish Superman could swoop in and end these seemingly endless conflicts? The image from the film of a young boy in the face of an invading army, bravely raising a makeshift flag bearing Superman's S, reminded me of another image I saw years ago, right after the tragedy of 9/11. It was a poster of Superman flying off in the direction of the World Trade Center with two simple words: if only. This film's promotions urge us to look up. If only there was more to see. Until next time, I'm David DiCerto, and this is The Catholic Lens. Don't miss a single episode of The Catholic Lens. Follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and for full videos of our film reviews, subscribe to Castletown Media on YouTube. Stay connected and join the conversation in the comments.